my suggestion to people who are at the cutting edge of AI right now is, don't get too boxed in. So you might think you're making AI for medical purposes, AI that can help diagnose X-rays, for example. If you're focused on that, step back and look at the whole picture. If your AI is generating diagnoses based on medical X-rays, what other imagery purposes, what else can this system be used for that you're not thinking about? And is there some smart kid out there in a dorm room who has been taking your product and using it for something that you didn't anticipate? If they are, listen to them, because that could be the future revolution right there.
Thanks as always to our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl at KYNDRYL, Kyndryl.com. Welcome to part 2 of this brilliant book, Steve Jobs in Exile, and the author, Geoffrey Cain. Welcome back, sir.
Good to be back, Aidan.
Great to have you back, man, and thank you for doing this. Geoffrey's just finished this book while he was having a baby, and the baby's with him now, so we're going to get through as much as we can, and he's kindly fitted us in for part 2. Doing 2 parts on this book does not do it justice. I know many of the interviews you do are shorter, but man, I don't know how you could fit in the amount of gold you have in this book. It's just a phenomenal piece of work. You sent me down so many rabbit holes with all the videos on YouTube that exist, loads of articles that are out there, but you've joined them together in a beautiful, beautiful way. And thank you for joining us for part 2.
Well, thank you, and honored to hear from you.
It's great, man. So let's start. I was kind of thinking part 2 would be the comeback, but we didn't even get through the crisis, because the crisis almost lasted 10 years as he burned through his personal fortune. He bought Pixar. There's so much in there, but let's start with a chapter you call When Reality Distorts Back. And this is a reference to his famous reality distortion field. But he couldn't distort this reality because the cube's expensive components had driven the price of the cube up to $6,500. That was more than double what he had initially promised, and light years from the $1,000 that had made the Mac a campus sensation. And that's in reference to it being an educational product. So let's pick up from there and just talk about how it just inflated, and also the backstory of him being driven by vitriol and rancor to prove himself after the ousting from Apple.
Right. So Steve Jobs was filled with a sense of vengeance when he started this company, NeXTcomputer, because he had been sidelined from Apple. He spent the summer of 1985 adrift, traveling, trying to figure out what to do with life. But his baby had been taken from him, and his baby was the Macintosh computer. That was the pride of what Steve Jobs had created. But he lost this power struggle with CEO John Sculley, who he had famously hired a few years earlier by saying, do you want to make sugar water the rest of your life, or do you want to come and join me and change the world? That was how he recruited John Sculley. And Sculley pushed him out, so he was angry. He was full of rage over what had happened. And so when he founded NeXTcomputer, the mission was to get revenge on Apple. And the decisions that he made became a series of mistakes precisely because of that, because he was trying to get back at Apple for removing him. Here's what's interesting about this story. This is what I always found so fascinating. People talk about the reality distortion field. That was Steve Jobs' most famous trait. It was this characteristic where he could walk in a room and he could look somebody in the eye and he could say, the sky is green, and they would end up believing him. He could convince anybody of anything. He could sell anything. That was really his masterly trait, something that people saw in him. But there's a limit to that. You can't bend reality to your will forever, and eventually reality is going to snap back at you and you're going to be put in your place. It's an iron law of the universe. I think there's a misconception out there that the reason Steve Jobs is so successful is because he could bend reality so well. He could put a computer in front of you and sell it to you in an instant. You would take out your checkbook, write that $4,000 check. But that's not how the Steve Jobs story actually went. In this period of his life, the middle period, he tried to do exactly that. He built this perfect cube, the NeXTcomputer. He unveiled it. It was October 12th, 1988, had a major launch event. It was the talk of the town. People had literally gotten on buses and come out from Kansas City because they wanted to see Steve Jobs again. This was his big debut after being fired from Apple. And this was going to be the moment when he would put his foot down and say, I am Steve Jobs and I'm here. And for the time, he gave a brilliant product presentation. He had a violinist from the San Francisco Symphony come in and played one of the first pieces in which a computer was calculating its part in real time and did it as a duet with one of the world's top violinists. And for the year 1988, that's incredible because you got to remember computers back then, they did loops and bleeps. I don't know how many people remember that. Maybe the younger crowd doesn't, but you put in your old NES, your Nintendo, or turn on your old Apple computer, and it was like a boop, 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 bleep, bleep, bleep. This was the end of it. And this was a new era in technology that Steve was heralding in. But back to the reality distortion field. So this cube comes out late 1988. It only sells about 100 computers in the first month. And I have all the data. I have all the old memos where they're stating the numbers. And it's something like 100 the first month, 50 the second month, 80 are sold the third month. The numbers are ridiculous. And Steve Jobs is there telling his team that actually we're going to sell a lot more. We're going to sell 10,000 this year. We're going to sell 50,000, 100,000. He keeps inventing these greater numbers to show that this is a success. But the reality, everybody sees it, is that they're only selling about 80 to 100 computers a month. So by any reasonable investor's accounting, that's a failure. That's not something that went so well, especially when you consider the amount of investment that goes into this technology. It's a loss. And so what's the lesson here? The lesson is that reality does distort back. Steve Jobs did not wish his way into success by warping the world around him, by warping people into his vision. The way that he got to success was how he figured out the way that his vision meets the world. And that's an entrepreneur's lesson. You can't fight the market. You can't swim upstream. If the market wants something and you're trying to cram something else down the market's throat, it's going to fail. And it's just an iron law of business. So I know it's kind of a prosaic lesson. It's not the kind of lesson that a lot of founders want to hear necessarily, because founders are visionaries by definition. And it's very easy to get caught inside your vision, to have this feeling of, I'm going to show the world what I'm made of and what I'm capable of. But ultimately, what the world needs from you might not be the vision that you have in your head.
I love that. And maybe we'll talk about that, because he just like Macworld, he'd created an event, he'd co-created and co-owned an event called NeXtWorld. And this was kind of the start of it, this expose, this demo with the violinist. But I wanted to mention something, because we'll move on from his early days, because there's a risk people might think that Steve Jobs remained an absolute jackass. And there's critics out there that said, well, he did. But when you read the book, you really see the transformation of a person and a hero's journey. Really, it's essentially like a movie plot. You see this person change and you see the character emerge over time, but from all the failures. And one of the horrible things he did, one of the many, was a young audio engineer who had joined, was in charge of making this sound, the audio software for Next, which actually, for those who use Mac, became an early version of GarageBand. And I love that in the story as well, that there's so many what are perceived failures that led to successes later, because he had enough runway and because he stayed at the table long enough. And I think that's a real important lesson as well.
Yeah, so that's the hero shithead roller coaster in action. That's another famous Steve trait. I believe we talked about that last time. There's the reality distortion field, and then there's the hero shithead roller coaster. And what Steve was great at doing, it was a double-edged sword. He was great at doing this, but it could also be to his detriment. It was his ability to look at somebody, look into their soul. Next executives, some of them called Steve a street hustler. He's like this guy, that was his personality. He could look at you and size you up immediately and reach into your soul and pull out things that you didn't know are there. And what I mean by that is talent, creativity, ideas. He was so good at walking into a room and pushing people, just pushing and pushing and asking harder questions like, why can't we do it this way? Why not that way? Why does the software have to look like that? The engineers would look back at him and say, well, this is how we do it. This is what software looks like in the year 1988. We can't do it anywhere else. But he would not accept that. The way that he approached creativity was sort of like being a film director, and the director is certainly different from an actor. Like, you're not the one with the roles, you're not setting up the costumes, but you have the vision, and your job is to bring out what you need from every piece of this film set, every person who's doing something, and unifying it into a whole. So there was something that a NeXT executive mentioned, that a lot of business founders, leaders out there, they tend to look at one or two parts of the business. That's a mistake. What Steve Jobs was so brilliant at was taking the whole thing and looking at it together. And that's how he could get these great ideas out of people who were focused on one or two things. It's outside the box thinking. That's exactly what it is. But, this was not always a great trait in him, because the flip side of this is that he could be, especially earlier in his life, mean and vindictive and nasty. He would go in, he would scream at people, yell at them, call them worthless, swear. Like, there was a lot of swearing that went on at the early NeXT computer, according to people who were there. It was not nice to be around Steve all the time. And one day he could hold you up. The next day he could cut you right down in front of an entire group. And in the book, there are many instances of this where he's just being outright irrational and he's just impossible to work with. It's interesting watching this in the life of Steve Jobs, because it's clear that he has this brilliance at the outset. He knows what creativity is and how to get his vision working with people, but he misapplies it early in his life, and he does it in such a way that he damages relationships, he chases off talent, he angers his investors. He's got that energy there, but he's pointing it in the wrong direction. And a lot of what my book is about is how he learns to harness this energy, how to work with it, how to not use it in a destructive way, but to use it in a building way. That's the magic of Steve Jobs, learning that lesson, how to build and not destroy.
One of the interesting things that came up, Geoffrey, was I was talking recently on an episode about Nokia and the culture at Nokia to Kui Hui and Timo Vuri, these two scholars who did a lot of research into the culture, the real culture in Nokia, much like you did in NeXT. And one of the things they said was the difference between Jobs and Olli-Pekka Kasavo, which was the CEO at Nokia, and the culture at Nokia, which was a screaming culture like that as well, very autocratic culture.
Heard those stories.
But they said the difference was Jobs sold people a vision for the future, a compelling vision. And to your point, he'd reach inside and he'd pull out something they didn't know was there, versus just being driven by fear. So yes, he used fear, but he actually used both the carrot and the stick at the same time. And that was a huge skill that he had.
Right. It's the carrot and the stick. That's a skill that a lot of talented CEOs are able to harness. It's unfortunate that early in life, Steve Jobs, was more of a stick guy. He would yell and scream and step over people's boundaries and so forth. But later in life, as this transformation happened, as he learned the lessons of failure, he learned the usefulness of the carrots and how, you really, as the CEO, there's even a quote, this was in the Steve Jobs archive, a video interview that recently surfaced. He talks about what it's like to realize what it really means to be a leader. And he says, look, he's talking about Pixar at this point. At Pixar, I have the most brilliant people working for me. They're at the cutting edge. Remember, this is the age of Toy Story, one of the greatest computer animated films of all time. And he's talking about just how good the people are he works with, and he wants to keep them around. And the realization he had is that there's a kind of inversion that happens when you're leading a company of highly talented people. The inversion is that you, the CEO, are actually at the bottom. The people you work with, the animators, the engineers, the software developers, the so forth, they're above you. They're at the top. It's an inverted pyramid. And your job as the CEO is to keep them around. And how do you keep them around? You treat them well. Remember, this is something that a Steve advisor told him. Steve's advisor said, remember that your assets have feet. Your employees, they're not people who you can just use and abuse. You have to keep them around, and you do that by being a more humble leader and asking for their advice and going along with it.
Beautiful. I think that was Paul Rand, the logo designer, actually might have said it from memory, or maybe Ross Perot. But he had so many people saying this to him all the time, and kind of going, you're going to lose good people. let's lean into that because he did. He burned so many bridges. Let's talk about the relationships, the original Next founders, because they went one by one. Daniel went as well,
Mhm.
and you see this oftentimes where a leader like Jobs will lose somebody like Daniel, and then publicly humiliate them in a way to go, it was his fault, not mine. And then also to let nobody else think that if you leave, by the way, I'm going to do the same to you.
Right, right. And that's one of the stories that pops up again and again in this book. The original Next co-founders, it was a team of 6 people. So there was Steve, and then there were 5 co-founders. They were Daniel Lewin, Susan Barnes, George Crow, Rich Page, and Bud Tribble. And these are some of the most talented people in Silicon Valley, the top engineers and marketers of their day. So Steve is taking a serious team with him. Now, what immediately happens is it's perfectly predictable. And I'm always careful about writing history because I try to put it from the perspective of the people living in the era. Like, if we do this, we don't know. If we make this decision, we don't know for sure how things are going to turn out. Like in World War II, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. They did not know that that was going to lead to the collapse of the Japanese Empire. You see these examples all throughout history, and you have to write from the perspective of people at the time with that uncertainty. So in this particular case, it was interesting because I thought I would go back into the archives and I thought I would find evidence of people who thought that they were making brilliant visionary decisions and that they truly thought this was going to be the next great technology of its era. But what I found was interesting because it wasn't that at all. This is like the opposite of most historical writing. Steve Jobs was the only person who truly seemed to think that he was doing something revolutionary. Everybody else was on board and they liked working at the company, but they were telling Steve the entire time exactly what was going to happen and how this was going to fail. The entire way through, from the start of the company till the 1990s, when the last co-founder left out of frustration, just frustrated with Steve, the entire time everybody was telling him, this is what you have to do, Steve. This is what's going to happen if you don't do it. And then years later, when they released the product, the exact things that they said were going to happen, the exact failures happened just as they said it was going to happen, but Steve was not listening to them. And when they told him that, Steve blamed them, just put it right back on them. Book to write, because you don't see that in a lot of places. You usually see much more disagreement among advisors, disagreement among colleagues. This might work, this might not. In this case, everybody knew what was going to happen, but Steve blew them off anyway. Major life lesson.
One of the things that was so different from what became Apple 2.0 was, and even Next 2.0, when they became a software company or a web objects company, was the difference in how they track things like bugs or released products. So the Cube was released and not fully working. It was buggy. It was breaking down all the time. The software was useless, dubbed useless by many, many developers. And on top of that, they didn't have much of an application database, so there wasn't many apps working on it. And you see this as an early version, and this is what I say about Jobs, had a second chance, which is so unusual. And I think there's a danger in reading this book that you looking at Steve Jobs, which is why it's so important you wrote this book, to think he was this genius that just laid out this vision and had this reality distortion field. But when you read your book and read it with other accounts of his life, you see, actually, he just learned from his failures time and time again.
And that's what I found interesting about exploring this period in the life of Steve Jobs. The biographical element, it's different from the way that most biographies kind of play out. And the reason is because here's the way I think about it. So this is a contribution that I've written. This is not the one defining story. There is an entire litany of biographies out there and histories, books on Apple, books on Steve Jobs, and so forth. And they all contribute something, but they all bring a different contribution to a man who's extremely complex, one of the most brilliant inventors of our age. He's not somebody you can pin down easily into one cardboard archetype or that sort of thing. And so Steve Jobs, what's interesting about him, I think about it this way. A lot of other biographies out there, those are the donuts. And what I've been doing here is writing the whole. This is the part that tends to get overlooked. You know, when you're looking at a donut, you don't think about the whole so much. But this is the goal of the book to show something that's a little different that we haven't really thought about before with Steve Jobs. And that's really what I'm trying to do here.
Let's talk about a couple of the investors here. So Canon was a huge investor who came in later on and got 16.67% of the company.
Right. So Canon came in, and they came in under interesting circumstances. So they originally were not, on Steve's list of investors, but they had built this optical drive for the next computer. And what this optical drive was the next generation of technology that was going to shape storage. It was also visually beautiful, something that Steve really liked. And as Canon was developing this drive, well, they were late and the drive didn't work very well, which is the story of Next Computer. Stuff just doesn't work because it's so far out of its time. And so what happened was that Canon, as a result of getting involved with this NeXTcube, ended up being pulled in as an investor because Steve Jobs needed money. He was just burning through cash left and right. He was almost out of money. And so who do you call? Call your supplier. It's Canon, major Japanese company. Of course, they're going to want to invest because this is Steve Jobs. And so that's really how Canon arrived. It wasn't just a matter of investing in the company Next, but it was because they saw Steve Jobs and his brilliance. And so they put money in. But not a relationship that ended well, like a lot of his relationships in this period, just because he was blowing through cash and not being accountable. So Canon eventually said sayonara, it just like everybody. So I don't want to get too far into the ending because there's a lot that happens that's hard to get into in one episode. But things do not end well with the way things are going here.
One of the other examples is IBM, and there's a brilliant story you tell about on their way to Dallas. So Steve, you call it Steve on a stick. This is what they used to call it, where Steve was a brilliant salesman. Like you said, he had this reality distortion feed, but he also gave great demos of the product. And he was on his way to an expo with IBM, and one of his colleagues, Mark Hayes, a salesman, comes up to him at a bookshop in San Fran in the airport, and he tells him, look, there's 2 screens here. And at the time you would have needed 2 separate presentations, and Steve had the only one. I'll let you take it from there. And this is an example of the ego, but also the self-sabotage.
There's so much self-sabotage in the life of Steve Jobs in the early part of his life. And this is such a great example because what happened was that IBM had entered a massive deal with Next Computer. They were going to build IBM workstations that could run Steve Jobs' operating system NeXTSTEP. So to put this into context, this is significant because you have to remember at the time that Windows was just starting to become the dominant operating system. One of the reasons we actually use Windows today, why it's so common, is because IBM had adopted it in these early years, and it was sort of like the operating system that everybody booted up if you didn't have an Apple. So Steve Jobs manages to convince IBM for its workstation market, which is a level up from PCs, to put NeXTSTEP on it, which is a major coup d'etat against Bill Gates because Bill wanted that market and Bill wanted to have the only operating system of the future. This is when he was creating his Microsoft monopoly of the era. Steve Jobs couldn't have had a better hand played to him with the help of all of his executives, because what this meant, if this deal had succeeded, then NeXTSTEP, today we would probably not be using Apple and the OS. We would actually be using the Next operating system. That's how significant this is. It would be everywhere, most likely. But Steve just sabotaged it. It's a very complicated story because he's a complicated man, but IBM, he couldn't get everything he wanted from IBM. They were slow to put the operating system on their computers. And in the end, Steve was afraid of giving up total control of his operating system. And you have to remember that he was always a man of total control. He wanted to have the walled garden where he controlled all the software and all the hardware. And he just couldn't imagine licensing away his beautiful operating system to IBM, a company that he hated. There was even a famous photo of him flipping off the IBM logo in New York City. It's one of those famous photos that everybody looks at. And so Steve Jobs sabotages this relationship. He just can't get what he wants from IBM. He doesn't want to give up control. And so they're about to go give this presentation. This is when talks are already breaking down. He's going to fly to IBM and give a presentation for 800 IBM employees. And the way that the room is set up is that it has 2 sides of the room, and each side has a slide, but they only have enough slides for one side of the room. So people can't look in both directions. They can't look, to the side or back or whatever it is. And so Steve Jobs is literally at the airport getting ready to fly out to New York to give this presentation, and tells his salesperson who's there with him, his assistant, I don't want to do this. I don't have enough slides. I don't have the tools I need today. So he literally got in his Porsche, drove home or drove to the office and said goodbye. So this poor salesman, Mark Hayes, who's very prominent in the company, has to show up to IBM's office, has to stand in that room with 800 IBM engineers, tell them that, sorry, there's no Steve Jobs today. And how does IBM take this? They realize that the deal is dead. This is just one example of many examples of this kind of behavior, and this is what gets Steve in trouble.
Maybe one last one, because there's loads. and this one was Daniel saying to Stephen, you're blowing it up. You're going to blow up the relationship with Ross. So put it in context. Ross Perot was a major investor, the chairman of the board as well, from memory, and had put lots of his own money in, believed in Steve, but brought, more importantly, he was such a strategic investor because he brought the government, he brought all the alphabet soup of government agencies with him because they wanted the security and the animation that the NeXTcubes could offer. But he blows this one up as well.
Exactly. Ross Perot is, here's how you think about Ross Perot. He's the Chuck Norris of technology. This is a guy who sent his employees into Iran during the revolution of 1979 to rescue other employees who were kept in an Iranian prison. It's like, that doesn't even happen anymore today. It's just we have drones and all this stuff. But, Ross Perot is a military veteran. He's tough as nails, straightforward. He tells you when you're wrong. And so, Ross is somebody who's very interested in Steve at the beginning. He signs up to be an investor. He's actually Steve's biggest backer. And part of the goal is that Ross Perot, who's a military government contractor, is going to line up NeXT computers with intelligence agencies, three-letter agencies, CIA, NSA, with the Department of Defense. They're chasing a lot of these major governmental contracts. And one of the reasons that the intelligence community loves the NeXT computer is because of this futuristic technology of the day. Just for example, that optical drive that Steve loves that I mentioned earlier, spies from the CIA like it because they can remove it and destroy it. And it's not like a hard drive where it sits around forever and, somebody can steal it and gain access to it. So NeXT computer is like exactly what these spies and soldiers need in the field. It's like the computer of the future of intelligence. And so Ross Perot has this all lined up. He's really well connected in government work. And so what does Steve do? He says, in the end, I don't want to work with the federal government. I don't like the feds. You have to remember Steve's personality. He's not a man known for bureaucracies and rank and file and hierarchies. That this is a world that is alien to somebody like Steve Jobs. He's the man of democratizing technology. He would rather have a computer that every student in a dorm room can use rather than a computer that's being used by the federal government, to manage databases. It's just not his style. And so Steve kills the relationship. He just decides, I don't want to do business with the feds. And so this puts his relationship with his investors, including Ross, up in the air once again, because they're saying, well, if you're not going to sell to the government, who is your market? Because you're only selling 100 of these computers a month to actual consumers. So you got to figure something out here.
So we talked in part one about how he had bought Pixar for a song. He got it for $5 million because Lucas was under pressure for a divorce settlement. But later on then, he's in a meeting with Disney executives, and this was a huge opportunity for both Pixar and NeXT, eventually for Pixar. But Disney was using Pixar software to develop movies like The Rescuers Down Under, but refused to give Pixar credit. And Steve kept a receipt on that. So despite having this opportunity where he was going to show them the technology, he blew that one up as well.
Exactly. So Disney was going to become potentially a major customer. Geoffrey Katzenberg at the time was I believe the CEO of Disney, and he was there. So this was a scene that a couple NeXT employees who were in the room with Steve recounted the same scene. And it was Steve in there with Daffy Duck. up on the wall. What he was doing is he was demonstrating this new color display that the new NeXT computer could use. Steve was really proud. This was the second NeXT computer release, and Steve was really proud that it now had color, which at the time was an innovation. And so he put Daffy Duck up on the wall, and he was making his pitch to the senior Disney leadership. They were going to potentially buy thousands of computers. Another example, big corporate acquisition, something that could really make a difference for the company. And instead of just swallowing his pride and selling the damn computer, he has to bring up his unhappiness with this deal with Pixar. So Pixar, his other company, is doing business with Disney, making computer graphics. But under their contract at the time, Disney was not giving credit to Pixar in these movies. And Steve didn't like that. He wanted credit. He thought that he was getting the short end of the stick. And so he brings this up, and it just becomes a fight. And Jeffrey Katzenberg, according to people in this room, legally threatened Steve and said, "You're using Daffy Duck on the wall without our permission. You have to get our permission for that." And then what happens in the end? So Disney orders something like 20 of these computers, maybe 100. I forgot the number, but it's so small, and it's just clear that Steve blew that one too.
So let's flip around, because he starts to change pretty much after he gets married, and you have a chapter here called "The Two Steves," and it's really when he's kind of hit rock bottom, and it so happens to be at the emergence of the internet as well. And a really interesting fact you learned from your book was that Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the internet essentially, actually used Cube, and as did another developer who created the game Doom that so many of us know.
Right. Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web, and he literally created the web on a NeXTcube computer. So originally, we think of the web as this sprawling network that anybody can log into. We use Facebook and social media. But at the beginning, in the year 1990, this was such a new concept, and it was literally running on one computer in a laboratory overseen by Sir Tim Berners-Lee. It was a NeXTcube. It was a NeXT computer. And this is just one example of how far ahead of its time this technology was. The NeXT computer was so sophisticated that in the year 1990, you could literally create the World Wide Web on this computer. I mean, think about that. Think about how many computers you need for the web to work, the cloud, all this technology. And there's one computer in a lab that can run the World Wide Web. It's just, I find that mind-blowing, the level of creativity that people could unleash on this NeXT computer. The other one, Doom, one of the greatest computer games of all time, one that is literally game-changing, play on words, I suppose, but literally changes the game industry from this old pixelated side-scrolling business to something that's more three-dimensional, shooting, gory, violent. This is a new age in gaming, and Steve Jobs did not care for it being built on a NeXT computer with NeXT software, because he just didn't like games. It wasn't his thing. And he didn't see games as something to be taken seriously. He wanted this computer to be used for scientific revolutions and medical discoveries. So another big mistake, they missed out. Doom had the Doom creators went to NeXT computer and offered to put made on a NeXT computer, like an opening screen on Doom. And they said, no, forget it. So another big missed opportunity. What is the lesson from all this? The lesson is that sometimes the product that you're making is so far ahead of its time that you're not sure what it can be used for yet. It's easy to get boxed in and to think I'm making something for this or that, something that solves this or that problem. But a lot of the time, if you're really at the cutting edge, you don't really know how it's going to be adapted out there. And if your users are speaking to you, if somebody's saying, I just created the World Wide Web, I just created a major video game, best-selling game on here, that's something to listen to, because that shows what your tech is capable of. And this is such a pertinent lesson to today with the AI revolution, the advances happening week by week with AI. We still don't know for sure how this is going to be adopted in so many cases. We see that people are now using it for generative purposes, for writing their school essays and so forth. But with this new agentic AI, AI bots that can go out there and actually make decisions and execute code without you having to approve it, that's a major, major revolution. I mean, that's technologically beyond anything that we've done before. A computer system that can process information on its own and doesn't need human oversight. I mean, that's major. So, my suggestion to people who are at the cutting edge of AI right now is, don't get too boxed in. Like you might think you're making AI for medical purposes, AI that can help diagnose X-rays, for example. If you're focused on that, step back and look at the whole picture. If your AI is generating diagnoses based on medical X-rays, what other imagery purposes, what else can this system be used for that you're not thinking about? And is there some smart kid out there in a dorm room who has been taking your product and using it for something that you didn't anticipate? If they are, listen to them, because that could be the future revolution right there. But maybe you're just not paying attention.
And one of the interesting ones was Next had always used Motorola chips. So that next thing that happens, Motorola goes with IBM and they cut out Next. So Next then go to Intel. But this leads to a far bigger pivot than they'd imagined and compromise that Steve was just not used to. And essentially Next becomes a software company.
Right. It's a comedy of errors, and it's all leading up to this final collapse of Next hardware. One of the things that historians remember is that Next, as a company, they tend to think of the hardware, the computer, the cube. That cube is famous in design schools, but really what was the game changer was the software that Steve was developing. But Steve wasn't really, as we just said with Doom and the World Wide Web, Steve was not paying attention to how his software was being adapted on the market. He only wanted it to be used for what he intended, and he didn't want to give up control. But this comedy of errors just plays out. It's one after the other. If you pick up my book, if you read it, you're going to see that it's a cascade of failure after failure, and each failure feeds the next failure, and it gets to this snowballing point where the failures are just so massive that the business can't possibly sustain itself anymore. So by the end, I guess it's not the end, by the middle, Next hardware, there's a reason it no longer exists today, because the company effectively goes bankrupt and he has to sell it off at a fire sale to Canon. So Steve Jobs this is rock bottom. And the final error in this whole tragedy is betting that Motorola, his main chip maker, is going to stand behind him. The small company, Next Computer. If you're making chips, that's a scaled, massive business. So you're working on billion-dollar contracts. And just because Steve Jobs comes along with his Next Computer that's selling 100 a month doesn't mean that you're going to drop your other contracts out there and just suddenly want to work with Steve Jobs. It's just not how the market works. And this is a lesson that Steve also had to absorb. What happened in the end was that Motorola just dumped Next Computer. They decided, pure business decision, cold, calculated. They decided that they're going to go with this new Power PC being designed by Apple and IBM. It's these two, Apple and IBM, were enemies and competitors, but they teamed up at this one point. And by this time, the writing is on the wall. Every single Next executive realizes that the hardware business is dead. We don't have a chip. A chip is the engine. Without a chip, we're screwed. And they realize, look, we made a lot of major mistakes, because at this point, Next Computer is about 8 or 9 years old. It's well into its business cycles. And they still haven't achieved the scale. They still don't have the sales. They don't have what they need. And so why would anybody in their right mind look at Next Computer and say, I want to work with this company that has been so small for 8 years, that's failed one after another? It doesn't make any sense. So it falls apart. They don't have a chip. And this is when the hardware business ends.
So next we're on to, everything's falling apart. He's really not enjoying it, Steve, here at all. He actually is getting most of his fulfillment from Pixar. He was putting $50 million of his personal wealth into Next, $54 million into Pixar, and combined all together, this new CFO comes in, and he estimated that he was burning through about $50 to $60 million a year to just keep these businesses alive. So then he recruits his former neighbor, Oracle founder Larry Ellison, to join the board. And he starts to get things together a little bit. And this guy, Dominique, this Belgian guy, he brings in a bit of discipline, and they start to get positive practices. So away from the deep shit list towards a more proactive list. And they start to track bugs and develop different types of apps. Maybe we'll mention this period of time where the change starts to happen.
So this is the change. This is where the transformation really hits. It's the end of the hardware business. The hardware business collapsed in 1993, springtime. And this is when NeXTcomputer becomes a software company. And why does it become a software company? It's not because Steve Jobs loves this software necessarily. It's just a matter of survival. And so they pivot and they do something finally that everybody's been begging them to do, but that Steve has refused at this point. They start selling enterprise software. So, like, think about this. Steve Jobs, the man in the turtleneck, the man with his brilliant, colorful devices and iPhone, his brilliant presentations. Can you see this guy walking into Goldman Sachs and standing up there and talking about finance and selling financial engineering to Goldman Sachs traders? Like, no, like totally no. Like that's something that nobody has ever seen in Steve. I mean, nobody outside of this period of his life. But at this point in the 1990s, this is what Steve is doing. He's going to Goldman Sachs. He's going to IBM. He's going to all these big federal bureaucracies, military. He's walking in, and even his physical appearance changes. He's no longer informal Steve, but he's wearing these gray and beige suits. You can look it up on YouTube, and he's got like formal red tie, and he wears white button-down cotton shirts that are nicely tailored. He looks like a corporate salesman. And Steve Jobs, like, if he's a corporate salesman, that's how you know he's hit rock bottom. That's not Steve Jobs. That's not who he is. And even the people around him told him, like, Steve, this is not you. Like, this is not who you are. But Steve knew that he had to survive, that he had to bring in the money. He had to build the business. He only had about 3 years of cash left. So if this had failed, he would have failed possibly permanently and maybe even been written out of history. He would not be remembered as the genius who we know today, but he would have been remembered as a failure. This is drastic. The stakes are high. And this is the moment where Steve finally concedes that reality has distorted back, that objective reality exists out there, and Steve has to conform to it. And so he finally starts conforming and doing just what he needs to do to keep the business alive, which means building stronger systems, doing basic things, keeping track of bugs. NeXTcomputer, for most of its life, did not have a method for keeping track of bugs and errors and so forth. It was a very disorganized company, and finally he brings order to it. And ironically, last point here, this is I think one of the greatest lessons for any founder out there. He knows when to step away finally, and when to let people do their job. This is the big lesson of this period. A man named Dominic Trempot, who becomes the CFO, he's a Belgian executive. He comes in and becomes Steve's right-hand man and institutes order in processes, in finances, ensuring that the basics are there, that how can we get out of debt and make a profit? If the company is not profitable, nothing else matters. So it's just basic business logic. And I just have to say, it's an unsexy lesson. You know, we love the sex appeal of being a founder, the hot presentations, like what's the next big thing. But sometimes you just have to sit down and work out the basics. You can't always be that star. You have to know when to pull away from being a star and when to look at your accounting books, when to hire somebody new, when to kill that debt. If you don't get the basics down, then the stardom is never going to come.
One of the, again, pivots, the many, many pivots of got rid of the cube. There's a deal with Sun that falls through because Sun weren't really committed to it. But they end up with this product called Web Objects, which came just out of Steve's desire to allow the developers to just be curious and follow their instincts. And a couple of guys built this basically a website over the weekend to track bugs. But it led to this thing they called Web Objects, which essentially became the underpinning of many of the products we use on Apple today.
Right. Web Objects is a forgotten app. You know, like Web Objects is one of those things that existed in its time in the 1990s, completely forgotten today, but one of Steve's favorite one of his favorite apps of the time. Okay, so here's the irony. I love the story of Web Objects because I think it encapsulates the many lessons of Steve Jobs in Exile. This is software that can create dynamic websites and update them real time, live. You have to remember, what the internet was like in the 1990s. These were I remember it well. I was a kid. These were these old static, these like odd colors that clash. Like people would make their personal websites and it's like pink and green. And then there's like a flashing animated GIF, of an icon and it's like their favorite car. Just, like the internet was, it was the Wild West of that day and people were just fiddling with it. But there was no way to, really build a serious business on the web yet. And Steve Jobs saw that. He even said himself that he had abandoned his idea that technology was going to change the world. He said that this was not going to change the world, but it will be helpful for businesses. And how will it be helpful? Look at the web today. Look at Amazon. Look at all these online shops, Barnes and Noble. Go anywhere on the web and it's all live, real-time, updated. You go in, you type what you want. You want to buy this or that, and then it gives recommendations with an algorithm. Like, this is now, Steve Jobs was planning for this 30 years ago. This was exactly what he saw was going to happen. And that's what WebObjects was. It was software that would create dynamic websites. So why is this so important for the book, for the lessons of the book? The one big takeaway here is that this is the culmination of what NeXTcomputer was really meant to do. They had ignored the original internet. The web, not the internet. They had ignored the original web created by Tim Berners-Lee. They had ignored Doom. They had released a cube computer that was not selling. But in all those failures, what was adding up was the real purpose of Next. And it was that it was a networked software. It was the software that was set, that if it had continued on this path, it would have been the software that would have led the transformation from the old age of the static, boring computer to the new age of the hyper-networked internet world that we all live in now. That's the vision of Steve Jobs, and that's what he saw that was just so far ahead of its time. It took a long time to get there because WebObjects was created in 1996. NeXTcomputer was created in 1985. So that's 11 years to figure out your true purpose in this world. So what does that mean? So those failures at Next did not go out for no reason. They had a purpose. It's just that it took a lot longer than Steve thought to get there. And if Steve had made decisions differently earlier on, they would have probably arrived at this much earlier and it would have been even more profitable. So it's a complex lesson, but it's a lesson of a mixture of knowing your timing, knowing your market, knowing the people you need to reach, and knowing which ideas might work sometime in the future versus what works now and what needs to happen right now.
So we'll start landing the ship because there's so many brilliant stories in there. Michael Dell Computers, Apple built this for him as basically his online store that saved his company. The origins of anybody who's ordered a pizza online all happened through WebObjects. But one of the big changes was Pixar, because Pixar gave him now a lifeline. And in a way, it kind of quenched that resentment that now he was somebody. He'd made something of himself. He'd vindicated himself in many ways. He still held on to that bad reputation from the Apple days and the Next days. But it gave him a different kind of energy. He had children, he'd been married, and there was a huge transformation, personal transformation going on.
Exactly. Pixar. Okay, so let me start with this. Steve Jobs, he was not a money man. He was not, he didn't do things for the money. He took his symbolic salary at Apple was $1 a year. Like he was not opening the books and trying to make it big. But the people who knew him during this time at Pixar said that money was useful to him because it allowed him to keep score. He didn't really want to be a billionaire. That wasn't his goal in life. But once the movie Toy Story from Pixar was a major success, and then right after that, it had a very risky but very successful IPO, that's the moment in 1996 that Steve became a billionaire. He joined the club. And you have to remember, today billionaires are a dime a dozen, but back then there were only a handful of billionaires in America, and one of them was Bill Gates, the richest man in the United States, and the other newcomer was Steve Jobs. So what does this mean it's not that Steve Jobs is happy to be a billionaire. It's that, oh, I am now vindicated. So all the things that I have been doing for the last 15 years, the failures, the ideas that went nowhere, the people who left me, well, finally I can recover, and finally I have money in the bank. And there are lots of lessons in here too for founders. I think that there's a kind of myth out there that if you're a creative person, you're not supposed to care about the money, that, like caring about money somehow taints or makes dirty your ideas. But no, you have to remember that even the most creative fields are at their core, they're businesses too. And there's always business logic that applies to them. Business means you have to have money in your bank account. You have to be profitable, because that money, it's not what you live for, but it's a tool. It shows you what the market thinks of your idea. If there's good feedback, you have money in the bank. If there's bad feedback, you lose money. That's what Steve learned, and that's the feedback he got. He became a billionaire because Toy Story was brilliant. And why was Toy Story brilliant? It was because he stepped away from Pixar and allowed his people to do their work.
Last one for you, because I know you have a baby about to wake up, and I know how precious your time is. You
Right
and your
now,
wife,
just with the baby.
your wife will be cursing me for taking your time, your precious time, when she's asleep. But the last one, which was an important one, is it's these transitions that I love that you did, Geoffrey. It's not like the story of Steve Jobs is he was fired from Apple, he disappeared, he found himself, and he came back as this hero. But it's these little stories like the serendipity of a phone call that saved Apple. So this was a developer inside Next who hears that Apple need an operating system. Their operating system, Copland, was failing. They had hired an IBM executive, the Iron Grandmother. She was out there looking for a new operating system. She'd been asked to do this by Jill Amelio, the chairman of Apple, who'd become interim CEO. And this guy just goes, why don't we just call Apple? It wasn't Steve's idea, which was really interesting. And this changed the fate and the course of history.
One of the incredible things about this book that I found is that we all know what happens at the end. We know that Steve Jobs returns to Apple and creates the Renaissance. I mean, that's not the question here, but around that time when he was returning to Apple, Steve gave an interview to Time magazine, and he said something remarkable in there that it actually sent shivers down my spine. He said, I don't believe that anything in life happens by chance, that there is a design, that there is an order to it. And that's my paraphrase. That's not the literal quote. But I'm sitting there thinking, once I got to that stage in the story, I'm sitting there thinking, okay, look at this entire story of NeXTcomputer. It's failure after failure. It's disaster. It's a company going down in flames. It's the reputation of Steve Jobs going down in flames. It's like everything that can go wrong does go wrong at NeXTcomputer. And yet there are a series of things that people do, not always Steve, but also just random people, that put the play back in a different order. And he ends up, through these series of decisions, returning to Apple and igniting the Apple Renaissance, creating the most valuable company in the world, the one that we all know today. And I'm sitting there thinking, like, this is Steve reflecting on the meaning of life and why things happen as they do. And it really is remarkable. If any of these little decisions had gone differently at any stage of the story, Steve would be written out of history. He would be completely forgotten today, and he would not be the person we read about in business case studies, for example. It would be a different world. And yet, at one point, there's one, like a mid-senior level employee at Next who just says, look, Apple is going to acquire another company. They're looking to buy an operating system. How about I just pick up the phone and call Apple and tell them more about NeXTSTEP and what we're doing? Steve is actually neglecting Next at this point. So he's all focused on Pixar, and like, he doesn't want to return to Apple. Lorraine, his wife, doesn't want him to return to Apple. The place, it's tainted. It's doing poorly. It's not the Apple that he knew back when he founded it. It's not a place that he wants to go to. And it's this random employee just picking up the phone, getting the attention of Apple, and then suddenly an executive nicknamed the Iron Grandmother. So Ellen Hancock is her name. Everybody said she was smart. She's the kind of person you want looking at this kind of thing. And she's the one who goes in and says, okay, let's take a look at Next. And that creates the cascade of events that lead to Steve even when he has uncertainty about it, that lead to Steve returning to Apple.
Beautiful, man. I think we'll leave it there because there is so many lessons in there. And if you get the book, and I highly recommend you, do read to the end, because Geoffrey does a great job of extracting the lessons from the story as well. And you know Geoffrey as much as I do. So many people don't get to the end of the book. They need to, but get to the end of this book. It's there. Oh, it's where it's. I'm after putting it. It's here beside me. It's a brilliant book. This is not the cover. I have an early access cover. Steve Jobs in Exile. Absolute brilliant story. And you do a brilliant job. And we'll be back again when the baby's a little bit older to cover Samsung Rising as well. One of your previous books that I absolutely love. Before I finish off, just let's tell people where they can find you.
I'm at X. My handle is at Geoffrey Cain. So my name, GEOFFREY _ Cain, CAIN. I'm on LinkedIn, and it's GCain. And then I'm also at my website, geoffreycain.net, where I post updates. And also check out my Substack, The Birder Files, which is my name, geoffreycain.substack.com.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm so grateful for you taking the time at this very precious time that you have. Author of Steve Jobs in Exile, Geoffrey Cain, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Aidan. Great to be here.
Thanks again to our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl at KYNDRYL, Kyndryl.com.